Relax, Mom. You're basically my ATM anyway, Vanessa said, smiling like she'd just told a harmless joke, her fingers tapping lightly against the stem of her wine glass as if nothing had shifted, as if something fundamental hadn't just cracked open in the middle of my dining room. I didn't react. Not the way she expected. I didn't flinch, didn't raise my voice, didn't even set my fork down right away. I simply took another bite, chewed slowly, and swallowed, as though her words were just another part of the evening, something to be processed and put away. The overhead light cast a soft glow across the polished oak table, the same table where I had hosted birthdays, holidays, quiet Sunday dinners for over 40 years, back when family still meant something that couldn't be reduced to numbers and transfers. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, completely at ease, scrolling through her phone between sips, already done with the moment that had just rewritten everything for me. She didn't notice how still I had gone. Or maybe she did, and it didn't matter. It usually didn't. That was the first thing I had learned. I set my napkin beside my plate and looked at her, really looked this time, not as my daughter, not as the little girl I used to braid hair for on school mornings, but as she was now, a woman who had learned exactly how far she could go without consequence. And the truth was, she had been right for a very long time, just not in the way she thought. 2 nights earlier, I had been sitting alone in my study, the house quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator down the hall, reviewing a stack of statements I hadn't bothered to open in months. I had trusted her. That was my first mistake. The numbers didn't lie. Charges I didn't recognize. Accounts I never opened. Small amounts at first, subtle enough to pass unnoticed if you weren't looking closely. Then larger ones, bolder, like someone testing the limits of a system they believed would never push back. I remember sitting there, my reading glasses slipping slightly down my nose, staring at those pages under the soft yellow lamp, and feeling something shift inside me. Not anger, not even sadness, just clarity. The kind that arrives quietly, without drama, and changes everything. I didn't call her that night. I didn't confront her. I didn't ask for explanations I already knew would come wrapped in excuses. Instead, I picked up the phone and made a different call. A necessary one. Back at the table, Vanessa laughed softly at something on her screen, completely unaware that the version of me she had always relied on no longer existed. I stood up, gathered my plate, and walked to the kitchen, rinsing it under warm water, my movements steady, deliberate. Behind me, she kept talking, filling the silence with the kind of casual comfort that only comes from believing you are untouchable. I dried my hands, turned off the light, and headed upstairs without saying a word. By the time she realized something had changed, it would already be too late. I did not sleep that night, not because of what Vanessa said, but because of how easily she said it, how natural it sounded coming from her, like she had rehearsed it in her mind 100 times before finally letting it slip out loud. And as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I realized that this was not a moment. It was a pattern, something that had been building quietly over the years while I chose not to see it, or perhaps chose not to name it for what it was, because naming it would have required me to act, and acting meant accepting that the relationship I believed I had with my daughter no longer existed in the way I had held on to for so long. And that kind of realization does not come with noise or tears. It comes with a stillness that settles deep in your chest and refuses to leave. And sometime around 3 in the morning, I got out of bed, wrapped my robe around me, and walked down the hallway to my study, the same room where I had sat 2 nights earlier reviewing those statements, the same desk, the same lamp, everything unchanged except for me. And I opened the drawer where I kept the documents I had gathered, neatly organized, each page telling a story I had ignored for too long, and I sat down and read through them again, slowly, carefully, not searching for errors this time, but for confirmation, and it was. All there, every transfer, every unauthorized charge, every quiet decision made on my behalf without my knowledge, and I remembered the small moments that had not seemed important at the time. The time she had brushed off my questions, the way she had grown impatient whenever money came up, the subtle shift in her tone whenever I hesitated before agreeing to help. And I saw it clearly now, how she had learned to anticipate my limits and gently push past them, not with force, but with confidence, because she knew I would not stop her, not really. And that was the part that stayed with me, not the money, but the certainty in her behavior, the belief that I would always be there to absorb whatever consequences she created for herself. And I realized that if I did nothing, that belief would never change. So I reached for the phone again, not with hesitation this time, but with intention, and I made the second call. The one that would ensure there was no easy way back to what had been. The one that quietly put every remaining piece of my financial life out of her reach. And when I hung up, I did not feel relief. I felt something steadier than that, something that did not depend on her reaction or her understanding. And I sat there until the first light of morning began to filter through the curtains, casting long, soft shadows across the floor. And for the first time in a long time, the silence in the house did not feel empty. It felt honest. And later that morning, I heard her moving around downstairs, the familiar rhythm of someone completely unaware that the ground beneath them had already shifted, cabinets opening and closing, the sound of her voice on the phone, light and careless, as if nothing had changed. And I stayed where I was, listening, not out of curiosity, but because I understood that this would be the last morning things felt normal for her. And I did not need to interrupt that. Not yet. Because some realizations are more powerful when they arrive on their own, without warning, without explanation. And I knew it was only a matter of time before she would begin to notice that something she had always relied on was no longer there. The first sign came just after 9 in the morning. A small sound from downstairs, the kind that would have meant nothing to me before, a drawer opening, then closing a little too quickly, followed by silence that stretched just a second longer than it should have. And I could picture her standing there in the kitchen, phone in hand, frowning at the screen, refreshing it once, then again, expecting the numbers to change back, expecting the world to correct itself the way it always had for her. And I remained in my chair, hands folded loosely in my lap, listening without moving, because I knew that moment mattered more than anything I could say. And then I heard her footsteps, faster now, crossing the hardwood floor, the cabinet doors opening and closing, the unmistakable shift from casual routine to quiet confusion. And a few seconds later, her voice, low at first, almost amused, as if she believed this was just a temporary inconvenience, something technical, something easily fixed. And I closed my eyes. For a moment, not out of exhaustion, but to steady myself, because even now, there was a part of me that remembered her as a child, sitting at that same kitchen table with a glass of milk and a plate of cookies, asking me questions about the world with a kind of trust that had once felt unbreakable. And that memory did not disappear just because the present had changed. It simply stood there, silent, asking me if I was certain about what I had done, and I let that question pass without answering it. Because certainty is not always loud. Sometimes it is just the absence of doubt. And when I opened my eyes again, I heard her calling my name, sharper now, edged with something new, something that had not been there the night before. And I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my robe, and walked down the hallway, each step measured, not because I was afraid, but because I understood that rushing would change nothing. And when I reached the kitchen doorway, she was standing by the counter, her phone pressed tightly in her hand, her brows drawn together, her expression caught somewhere between irritation and disbelief. And for a brief second, she looked at me the way she used to, as if I were the person who would fix whatever problem she had encountered, as if I were still the solution. And I saw the expectation in her eyes before she spoke, before she demanded an explanation, before she tried to pull me back into the role I had quietly stepped out of. And that was the moment I understood something clearly, more clearly than I had understood anything in years. That this was not about the money she had lost access to. It was about the certainty she had lost, the belief that I would always be there to absorb the consequences of her choices. And when she finally spoke, her voice rising just slightly, asking why her card was not working, why the account showed nothing, why the transfers had stopped, I did not interrupt her. I did not correct her tone. I simply listened until she finished, until the silence returned between us, and then I stepped into the room fully, meeting her gaze without hesitation. And for the first time, I did not see my daughter in front of me. I saw a woman who had built her life on assumptions that no longer existed, and I realized that what came next would not be a conversation about fixing something broken. It would be the moment she understood that what she had relied on was never guaranteed. It was given, and now it was gone. She waited for me to answer, her fingers tightening around the phone as if holding it harder would force the numbers to change back, and I could see the impatience building in her posture, the slight shift of her weight, the way her eyes searched my face for the familiar response she had always received. Reassurance first, solutions second, questions never, and I realized how deeply that pattern had been set between us, how many years it had taken to build, and how quietly it had been broken in. A single night, and when I finally spoke, my voice did not rise to meet hers. It remained even, measured, almost gentle, the kind of tone I used when explaining something simple but important, and I told her that nothing was wrong with the accounts. Nothing had been lost or misplaced. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be, just no longer accessible to her. And for a moment she did not understand. The words reached her but did not settle, and I watched that delay, that brief gap between hearing and comprehension, and then I saw it. The exact second it clicked, the way her expression changed, not dramatically, but enough, her eyes narrowing slightly, her lips parting as if to respond, and then stopping, recalculating, searching for a different approach, and she asked again, slower this time, as if adjusting her tone would adjust the outcome. What do you mean it is not accessible? And I held her gaze and answered just as calmly as before. I mean that I removed your access, that the transfers you were expecting will not be happening anymore, that the accounts you have been using are no longer connected to you in any way, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, filled with everything she had not anticipated, and I could see the questions forming behind her eyes, not about whether this was true, but about how it had happened without her. Noticing how something she relied on so completely had shifted without warning. And then came the first sign of something else, not panic yet, but resistance, the instinct to push back against a reality that did not match her expectations, and she straightened slightly, her voice tightening as she told me there must be a mistake, that I could not just do that without telling her, that she had bills, responsibilities, things that depended on those accounts, and I listened without interrupting. Not because I agreed, but because I recognized the pattern, the way she framed her needs as obligations I was meant to fulfill, and when she finished, I took a step closer, resting my hand lightly on the edge of the counter, grounding myself in the moment, and I told her that there was no mistake, that everything had been done intentionally, carefully, and with more thought than she had ever given to the way she used my name, my credit, my resources, and I did not raise my voice, I did not list every transaction or accusation. I simply let the truth sit between us, unembellished and impossible to ignore, and for the first time since she had spoken the night before, I saw something unfamiliar in her. Expression, not anger, not yet, but uncertainty, the realization that the version of me she had counted on was no longer responding in the way she expected, and that realization unsettled her more than any argument could have, because it meant she no longer understood the rules of the situation, and as she stood there, searching for the next thing to say, I understood that this was not the end of the conversation. It was the beginning of something she had never had to face before, a world where my silence did not mean agreement, and my calm did not mean weakness, but something far more final. She did not argue right away, and that was how I knew she was thinking, not reacting, her mind moving quickly through possibilities, searching for leverage, for something she could say that would shift the balance back in her favor, and I had seen that look before, not in moments like this, but in smaller ways, in conversations where she needed something and was deciding which version of herself to present, the grateful daughter, the overwhelmed adult, the one who reminded me of everything she was dealing with as if it justified everything she took, and I watched as that calculation played out behind her eyes now, more urgent, more exposed, and when she spoke again, her voice had softened just slightly, not enough to sound sincere, but enough to test a different angle, and she said that she did not understand why I was doing this, that if something had gone wrong we could talk about it, that there was no need to make things difficult, and I let those words settle in the space between us, recognizing them for what they were, not an attempt to understand, but an attempt to restore what had been taken from her, without having to acknowledge how it had been used, and I realized then that she still believed this was a misunderstanding, something that could be smoothed over if she found the right tone, the right combination of concern and patience, and I felt no urge to correct her immediately, because sometimes clarity does not come from explanation, it comes from the absence of what you expected to be there, and I told her, simply, that nothing had gone wrong, that this was not about a mistake or a miscommunication, that this was the result of something I had allowed for too long. And she frowned slightly, the softness in her expression fading as the meaning of my words began to take shape, and she asked what I meant by that. And I answered without hesitation that I meant the years of transfers she never questioned, the accounts she used without asking, the decisions she made with my name attached to them as if it were her own. And I did not list every detail. I did not need to, because the truth was not in the specifics, it was in the pattern, and she knew that pattern as well as I did, even if she had never expected it to be named. And for a moment she said nothing, her gaze shifting away from mine, her shoulders drawing in just slightly, and I could see the first real crack in her composure, not because she felt remorse, but because she was beginning to understand that this situation was not going to resolve the way it always had, that I was not going to step in and restore what she had lost. And then came the question I had been expecting, the one that revealed more than anything else she could have said. She asked how she was supposed to manage now, how she was supposed to pay for things, how she was supposed to maintain the life she had built. And I listened carefully, not to the words themselves, but to what was missing from them. There was no acknowledgement of what had been done, no recognition of the line that had been crossed, only concern for what she no longer had access to. And that was when I understood that this moment was not about convincing her of anything. It was about stepping out of a role I had occupied for far too long. And I told her, calmly, that managing her life was something she would have to figure out on her own, that the support she had relied on was never meant to replace responsibility, and that I would not be continuing in that role any longer. And she stared at me as if I had spoken in a language she did not recognize, as if the idea itself was unfamiliar. And in that silence, I could feel the shift settling into place, not just for her, but for me as well, because saying those words did not feel like taking something away. It felt like returning something to its proper place, and for the first time in a very long time, I was not waiting for her reaction to decide what I would do next. Her reaction did not come all at once. It unfolded in layers. First the disbelief, then the resistance, and finally something sharper, something closer to frustration. And I watched as her posture changed, her shoulders lifting slightly, her chin tilting upward, as if she could re-establish control simply by standing a little taller. And when she spoke again, the softness was gone, replaced by a tone I had heard before but never fully acknowledged, a tone that carried expectation more than respect. And she told me that I was overreacting, that everyone helps their family, that what she had done was not unusual. And I let her finish, because I recognized that argument, not as truth, but as justification, the kind that fills the space where accountability should be. And I noticed how she avoided certain words, how she did not say permission, did not say approval, did not say thank you. And I realized that those absences mattered more than anything she was saying out loud. And I felt no urge to interrupt, no need to correct her phrasing, because this was no longer a discussion about definitions. It was a moment of recognition. And when she paused, waiting for me to respond, I simply told her that helping family is a choice, not an obligation, and that choice requires respect, something that had been missing for a very long time. And she let out a small, incredulous laugh, the kind people use when they do not want to take something seriously, and she asked if I was really going to make this into an issue of respect, as if that word itself were exaggerated, unnecessary. And I met her gaze without shifting, because I understood now that the weight of that word had never mattered to her in the way it had mattered to me. And I told her that respect is the only thing that determines whether help continues, that without it, there is nothing to sustain, nothing to build on. And she shook her head slightly, pacing a step away from the counter, her movements quicker now, less controlled, and I could see the frustration settling in, not because she understood my point, but because she could not find a way around it. And that was when her voice changed again, rising just enough to reveal what she had been holding back. And she asked if I expected her to just figure everything out on her own overnight, if I thought it was fair to pull everything away without warning. And I listened to that question carefully, because it was not really a question, it was a statement of belief, the belief that what she had been receiving should have continued indefinitely, that it was something she was entitled to rather than something that had been given. And I realized that this belief had shaped every decision she had made, every assumption she had carried into this moment, and I answered her calmly, telling her that fairness is not measured by how long something has been allowed to continue, but by whether it was right in the first place, and that continuing something harmful simply because it has become familiar does not make it just. And she stopped pacing then, turning to look at me again, and for a moment there was silence, not the heavy kind from before, but something more uncertain, as if she were trying to decide whether to argue further or to change direction. And I could see the conflict in her expression, the part of her that wanted to push harder, to demand, to insist, and the part that was beginning to understand that those tactics were no longer effective. And in that pause, I felt something settle within me, something steady and unshakable, because I was no longer responding to her tone or her expectations. I was responding to something deeper, something that had been waiting for this moment to be acknowledged, and I realized that whatever came next, whether she argued, withdrew, or tried to rebuild the situation in a different way, it would not change what had already been decided, because this was not about winning a conversation. It was about ending a pattern, and that decision had already been made long before she walked into the kitchen that morning. She did not respond right away, and that silence told me more than anything she had said so far, because it was no longer filled with arguments or explanations. It was filled with calculation, the kind that happens when someone realizes that the usual ways of navigating a situation are no longer available, and I could see it in the way her eyes shifted slightly, not away from me, but around me, as if she were looking for something in the room that might give her an advantage, something familiar she could hold on to. And for a brief moment, she seemed smaller, not physically, but in the way her certainty had begun to collapse under the weight of something she could not control, and I stood there without moving, giving her the space to process what had already been decided, because I understood now that this was not about forcing her to accept anything. It was about allowing her to see that there was nothing left to negotiate. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, but not softer. There was still an edge to it, a tension that had not yet resolved. And she asked if this was really how I wanted things to be between us, and I recognized the shift in her approach, the move away from finances into something more personal, something that carried the weight of our relationship. And I knew that question was meant to pull me back, to remind me of what could be lost if I did not reconsider. And for a moment, I let that question exist without answering it, because it deserved more than a quick response. It deserved the truth, not the version of it that keeps things comfortable, but the one that changes them permanently. And I told her that this was not about what I wanted. It was about what had already happened, about the choices that had been made over time, choices that had shaped the relationship into something I no longer recognized. And I spoke slowly, not to emphasize my words, but to make sure they were clear, because clarity does not need volume. It needs precision. And I told her that I had spent years believing that support meant staying silent, that helping meant not asking questions, that being there for her meant stepping in whenever she needed something without ever asking why. And that belief had created something neither of us had questioned until now, something that looked like care on the surface but functioned like dependency underneath. And I could see her listening, really listening this time, not because she agreed, but because she did not know how to interrupt without losing the thread of what I was saying. And I continued, explaining that I was not removing myself from her life, but I was removing myself from that role, the one that had allowed everything else to happen without consequence. And that distinction mattered, even if she did not see it yet. And she let out a slow breath, her shoulders lowering slightly as if the weight of the situation had finally settled in. And for the first time, there was no immediate response, no argument waiting to take its place, just a pause, a real one. And in that pause, I saw something shift, not completely, not enough to change everything, but enough to create space for a different kind of understanding. And I realized that this moment, quiet as it was, held more meaning than anything that had been said before, because it was the first time she was facing the situation without the expectation that it would resolve in her favor. And as we stood there, the distance between us no longer measured by steps or words, but by everything that had been unspoken for years, I understood that whatever came next would not be a return to what we had, but the beginning of something uncertain, something that would require both of us to exist without the roles we had grown used to. And for me, that uncertainty did not feel threatening. It felt necessary, because for the first time, I was not standing in that room as the person she expected me to be. I was standing there as myself, and that was something I was no longer willing to give up. She did not say anything after that, not immediately, and I could see that she was no longer searching for the right argument or the right tone. She was trying to understand something that did not fit into the way she had always seen me, and that realization changed the energy in the room more than any raised voice ever could have, because for the first time, she was not speaking from certainty. She was standing in uncertainty, and that was unfamiliar territory for her. And I watched as she slowly set her phone down on the counter, not with frustration, but with a kind of quiet hesitation, as if even that simple action required more thought than it should have. And then she looked at me again, really looked this time, not as the person who would fix things, but as someone she did not fully recognize anymore, and I understood that moment, because I had gone through it myself not long ago, sitting in my study, looking at numbers that did not make sense until they did, and once they did, everything else had to change, and she asked, more quietly now, what happens next? And it was the first question she had asked that was not about money, not about access, but about direction, and I took a breath before answering, not because I needed time, but because I wanted to choose my words carefully, and I told her that what happens next depends on what she chooses to do, not what I decide for her, that her life is still hers to manage, to build, to adjust, and that nothing I had done removed that from her. It only removed the part where I carried it for her. And she listened, her expression still tense, but no longer defensive. And I could see that she was trying to process a future that did not include the safety net she had always relied on. And that kind of shift does not settle in all at once. It comes in pieces, small realizations that slowly replace old assumptions. And I stepped back slightly, giving her space, not as a gesture of distance, but as a recognition that this part was hers to face. And she asked if this meant I was done helping her completely, and I shook my head gently, telling her that help is not the issue. The way it is given and received is what matters, that support does not mean silence, and care does not mean unlimited access, and I could see that distinction. Landing somewhere between understanding and resistance, not fully accepted, but no longer dismissed, and she nodded once, almost to herself, as if acknowledging something she was not ready to say out loud. And then she picked up her phone again, glancing at the screen, not with expectation this time, but with a kind of cautious awareness, and I recognized that look too. The moment when someone begins to see their situation clearly, not as it was before, but as it is now. And I turned away from the counter, walking slowly toward the doorway, because I understood that staying there would not change anything further, that the conversation had reached its natural end, not with resolution, but with clarity. And as I stepped into the hallway, I felt something settle within me, not relief, not satisfaction, but something steadier than both, a sense that I had finally stepped out of a role that had defined me for too long, and that whatever came next, whether it was distance or something new built on different terms, it would not be shaped by the same expectations that had brought us to this point. And behind me, the house was quiet again, not empty, but different, as if it had adjusted to a truth that had been there all along, waiting to be acknowledged. The rest of the day passed without another confrontation, but the silence between us was not the same as it had been before. It was no longer filled with unspoken expectations or quiet assumptions. It was clear, defined, and for the first time, honest. And I moved through the house with a sense of awareness I had not felt in years, noticing small things I had overlooked, the way the afternoon light settled across the living room floor, the faint ticking of the clock above the mantel, the absence of tension that I had once mistaken for peace, and I realized how much of my life had been shaped by maintaining something that no longer existed, something I had held together out of habit rather than truth. And later that evening, I heard Vanessa in her room, her voice low as she spoke on the phone, not laughing this time, not confident, but careful, measured, as if she were choosing her words more deliberately than before. And I did not listen for the details. I did not need to, because I understood what was happening. She was adjusting, not completely, not yet, but beginning to, and that process would take time, that I was no longer responsible for managing. And I made myself a cup of tea, standing by the kitchen window as the sky shifted from pale blue to a deeper shade, the kind of quiet transition that happens without anyone noticing unless they choose to. And I thought about the years behind me, the choices I had made, the ones I had avoided, and I did not regret helping her, not in the way she had needed it when she was younger, when support had been necessary, when guidance had been something she accepted rather than resisted. But I did recognize the point where that support had changed into something else, something that no longer served either of us, and acknowledging that did not feel like loss. It felt like understanding, and when she came downstairs again, her movements were slower, less certain, and she paused when she saw me, as if unsure how to continue, and for a moment, we simply stood there, not as we had been before, but not entirely separate either, something in between, something undefined, and she asked, quietly, if I was going to be all right, and the question caught me slightly off guard, not because of the words themselves, but because of what they implied, a shift in perspective, small but noticeable, and I nodded, telling her that I would be, that I had been for a long time, even when it did not look that way, and she held my gaze for a second longer before looking away, and I could see that she was thinking, not about how to fix things, but about how to move forward within a reality that no longer included the same assumptions, and I did not offer advice, did not step in to guide her through it, because that was no longer my role, and as the evening settled in, the house felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just clearer, as if something that had been clouding it for years had finally been removed. And I understood then that what I had done was not about taking something away from her. It was about giving something back to myself, something I had slowly let go of without realizing it. And that realization did not come with celebration or relief. It came with a quiet certainty, the kind that does not need to be announced or defended. It simply exists, steady and unchanging. And as I turned off the lights and made my way upstairs, I knew that whatever came next, whether it was distance, repair, or something entirely new, it would be built on truth rather than assumption. And that was something I was finally ready to accept, no matter where it led.